Hey folks, my name is Adam and I like to make tiny nerdy things, and lately I've been a bit too high on myself and I felt like I needed to be knocked down a couple of pegs. So naturally, I started playing a little Hollow Knight, and at some point during my bouts of angry crying I thought, hey, I should make this. As always, the first thing to make is the thing that lets us make the other thing on top of it. Some would call it an armature, but that feels a bit grandiose for what is really just a single piece of bent wire. Of course, that bent piece of wire needs somewhere to be mounted, which is what this gnarly block of wood is for. And then, of course, that wire needs to be bulked out a bit to avoid using too much clay. And then finally, of course, the now bulked out wire needs to be covered in our aforementioned clay. That being said, if I just slapped the clay on with editing magic, it would sort of defeat the whole point of this video, so instead we'll do it the old-fashioned way. I'll start by getting a thin layer of Cosclay onto the wire thing so that I can get the proportions correct-ish. The knight's body is significantly smaller than its head, and I don't want this thing to be a foot tall, so I'll try and refrain from adding too much clay to the body. Of course, it wouldn't be a north of the border video without gratuitous butt-cheek sculpting, and this little black bug knight is no exception. Otherwise, that's pretty much it for shaping the body, but the knight is exceptionally smooth, so I want to make sure I take the time to get it as crisp as possible. Finally, once I've got it looking buttery smooth, I'll pull it off the stand and get it into a more action-y pose. Now, you may be wondering why I didn't just sculpt it in the correct pose to begin with, and the reason is, I don't know. Otherwise, I can throw it in the oven to bake it, then crack out a couple sanding sticks and smooth out any of the final rough edges. Sanding is going to be a recurring theme here, so put on your ASMR pants. Otherwise, I can drill a hole in one side and make a single arm that will be holding his sword. I only need to make the left arm since the right side will be covered by his cape. Now, because the knight has little flipper hands instead of fingers, I'll get the right shape of the hand using a tiny toothpick to curve the arm around so that I can attach the sword later. Now, the knight's cape is pretty tattered, but it's also got a kinda tentacly look that's really highlighted whenever you dash or you see its ghostly shade. To that end, I figured it would behoove me to make the cape kinda tentacly as well, so I've wrapped a bunch of tiny wound wires in little wormy dealies, then draped them around the knight's shoulders, flaring out at the back. By inserting the wire into the clay, it's got enough strength to hold itself rigid, which allows me to add little sections in between, fill in the gaps, and carve a bit more detail where needed. With the overall cape shape looking great, I can start to add a little folds and creases to break up the flatness of the cape and to really highlight that Lovecraftian style. Then a final rollover with some ball styluses to help smooth out the rougher edges before giving the entire thing a healthy coat of isopropyl alcohol to remove any of the tooling marks, and then I can get started on the knight's head. Now, as I'd mentioned before, the knight's head is big, but like bigger than his body big, like bigger than I had expected big, and it resulted in me adding clay on clay on clay until I got an oversized Lego man shaped blob of clay upon which I could poke two oversized eye sockets into. Then finally the eye sockets got expanded by way of ball stylusing and thumb hooking, then it was into the oven to cure, and I could get to the much maligned sandpaper ASMR. Which finally leaves me with an incredibly smooth, oddly adorable Hollow Knight head. All that's left to do then is add some little blobs of clay to each of the eye sockets to cover up that unsightly aluminium brain. Then I can drill a couple holes on the side and insert some wire to finish off that patented Beetle Knight look. I'll do a little wire-on-wire inception to give the clay something to hold on to before wrapping said wire in said clay and building up the horns. Once I've got the shape I'm after, I'll make sure to blend it in as much as possible into the rest of the head. Then once it's been baked, I'll come at it again with some files and sanding sticks to completely remove the joints. Finally, I can stick the head onto the body. Now, I'm not going to bake them together since I want to be able to remove the head for painting, but by pressing the cured head into the uncured body, I can make a perfect indent so when I glue them together later, there's no gap. Otherwise, all that's left to do is make a Hollow Knight's nail. I'll start with a little wormy dealie that gets rolled out, then pinched inwards towards the center so that I have a pretty ugly looking little clay sword. Then, once it's been baked and tempered in the forges of my oven, I can sand the shit out of it. Then, with an impressively sharp little clay sword finished, I can add a toothpick handle, cut it to size, and wrap it in clay. Then the absolute final detail will be adding all the little cracks along the flat of the blade. Then it's finally on to painting. I figured the airbrush would make short work of the majority of the work, especially since there's really only two main colors, black and white.
Technically, black and white aren't colors.
Regardless, most of the body is black and most of the head is white, so I prime both with their respective shades. Then the head will get its eye sockets painted black, trying my absolute damnedest not to accidentally paint outside the sockets, and then I'll give the cape a base coat of a very dark blue, working my way up with slightly brighter shades of the same blue to give all the edges of the cape a nice bright blue highlight. Now I wanted to keep the cartoony aesthetic of the game, and I thought that the over-exaggerated colored highlights ended up looking pretty not too bad at all. I'll give the nail sword a dark gray base coat and then dab a much lighter gray over top using a sponge, which again I think gives a pretty great effect before highlighting the edges with a very thin white. Then I'll add some white streaks to the flat of the blade to do something. I don't know, I just kind of liked it. Otherwise, our hollow hero is finished and it's time to make a base. Now, I had originally thought about making a tiny rock outcropping that the knight would be cresting triumphantly, but then I remembered that it's mostly beetle shells and chitinous bug stuff strewn about and decided to make this thing. Now, I'm not really sure what it is, but I like it and it's a bit more thematic than just making a rock. And don't get me wrong, I love a good rock. Hell, some of my favorite childhood memories are playing with rocks. But like all good things, you need to know when the situation calls for a rock, and when it calls for a creepy chitinous beetle shell looking pile of unidentifiable. Now to make said creepy chitinous beetle shell looking pile of unidentifiable, I've made a big blob of clay, covered it in flatworms, then added a bunch of random balls and sausages until I don't know what I'm doing. Then I'll add some ball stylus texture by way of rolling and smacking, before adding some worms to the sections to highlight the individual plates. Then I'll give this creepy bug horse thing a set of saddles, add some more worms, then add some more worms, before finally adding even more randomly placed worms. And a tiny bit of grass too, I guess. Then it's into the oven to cure and I can get to the painting. I'll start with black, then add some more black and some final touches with the black until the whole thing is black. Then I'll decide that it's perhaps a bit too boring, so I'll try and add some haphazardly slapped on dark grays with lighter gray highlights to give the whole thing a bit of a slimy, shiny look. If nothing else, it does help to break up the bland of the black a tiny bit. Finally, I'll go over a couple of the sections with some purples and blues just to add a little bit of color variation. Then once the paint's dried, I can start building my tiny hollow knight. Then finally, with the sword in place, we're onto the glamour shots. As always, a huge thank you to the fine folk over on Patreon that keep this channel running, and a very special thank you to my newest patrons, Mara Houston, Layla Simonon, Libby Stone, Robin Salter, Maya Elmfauna, El Nathan Ow, Officer Depot, Sparky, Kate and Amy, Jacob Moser Sr., Mild Inconvenience, H. Hearts, Stealth Flower, Enrique Orlina, Merge Sturge, Zach Graceman, Chris Rowe, Argus 303, Amanda La Loggia, and Ash Horowitz, aka Black Dragon. You are the surprisingly strong little black body that keeps this oversized head of a channel off the ground. If you'd like to help out, then hey, I love me and my subscribers as much as I love rocks. Of course, sharing this video, giving it a little thumbs up if you liked it, or a thumbs down if you hated it, goes a long way into tricking YouTube into thinking this channel isn't complete and total trash. Otherwise, we'll see you next time. Cheers.